This week on The Wheelhouse, 250 years of America. Who gets to tell the story of who we are as Americans? For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. This year marks 250 years since the Declaration of Independence was signed. Across the country, communities are celebrating the nation's founding and reflecting on the ideals that shaped the United States. But anniversaries also invite us to ask a deeper question. Whose stories have become part of our shared history? And whose stories are only now beginning to be told? This hour, we're exploring the lives of Black Americans whose experiences have been largely absent from the history books. And later, we zoom out. How are museums, historic sites, educators thinking about the way America's story is told, especially amidst efforts to paint a rosier picture of our nation's forefathers? First up, John Mills is a Connecticut resident. He's also the founder and president of the Alex Brienne Corporation, which we're happy to tell you about right now. John, thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate you guys having me. Thank you.
I appreciate you coming here. I can't wait to talk about a little bit about what you're doing, your book as well, The Narrative of Primus, A Lineage Woven into American History. John, let's begin with the Alex Brienne Corporation. Yep. You began this Hartford-based nonprofit in 2022. Tell us about the organization and its ideals.
Yeah, what we do is we start in the past. We find someone, an African-American enslaved person who lived 200, 300 years ago. And somebody who's rarely or barely mentioned in a single document. And then we try to take that individual and start tracing forward in time until we can get someone who is alive that's related to that individual. And we try to find them. It's called reverse genealogy. I specialized in that as a secondary hobby, basically. I started doing research into this discipline back in the late 90s. But in 2022, I just started doing it more formally.
Reverse genealogy, but you're like a software architect in like your real day job?
In my day job, I'm writing and building and handing off specs for software for people to build, which is great. I've been doing that for 35 years, but my passion lies in this work. So my nonprofit on the side, I'm scrambling and running to do that.
So not to talk about your full-time job, we want to talk about why you're doing this. So just help me understand how you have to find time to do this then, and where the journey begins to explore this passion instead of, just trying to find some time in your regular day job or afterwards to do your passion. Tell us that.
Well, this all started, I grew up in San Diego, California, and in the 70s, and in California of that time, there were organizations like the Panthers and the Competing Us organization, all these organizations that were starting up during the Civil Rights Movement. And my father aligned heavily to what they were talking. So he would talk to me about pride in my skin color, my features, and my hair texture, and constantly. But by the late 80s, I was married and I was in the workforce, and I recognized I didn't have much of a pride in myself. Like, it became clear how I was presenting to the world and in the workplace, and that upset me. I didn't understand how I could see white Americans as more important than me when I had this father that was so deep into ensuring that didn't happen. But that's where I ended up. That was my entry into genealogy. My sister introduced me to some people that I was related to based on her doing genealogical work that changed my perspective on pride for self. And that's the beginning of my journey.
Mills family here, some forensic scientists here. So there's your father who's an influence, but you start to research your grandfather as well.
Yeah, my sister did all of that research. She introduces me. My grandfather was from East Texas. He never talked about his home or that experience. He moved with the Great Migration from the South to California in the late 1930s, and he never talked to us about it. So he passed in 87, and my sister starts doing research, learns that his grandfather was enslaved in Texas, was freed on Juneteenth. We learned where his mother was buried. She died in 1918 of the flu pandemic. which aligned me to American history. That was an event, the flu pandemic of 1918. And then we flew to Texas, and we wanted to see where she was buried and where our great-great-grandfather who was enslaved was buried, and we found them in the woods behind a whites-only cemetery. And so then I could picture my grandfather having to walk past prestige and reverence a white cemetery, clean and maintained, to have to walk into the woods to bury his mother. Like, there were things that were hitting me while I was there, which gave me a reverence for the people we don't talk about. Like, I had been told to revere Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman, and I had this handful of people that I was told all my life, those are the people you revere, the one in a millions. And I all of a sudden became a person who revered the million, because those were the people I was related to, and I knew nothing about them. And that pride had my shoulders go back, and my work is about giving that same context to people who are living today. The gift my sister gave me in the 90s when we went through that experience.
Can you revel in that a second? Because it sounds like that's where you're starting to develop now an appreciation.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
An appreciation for the people who worked hard, they toiled for years, they were never truly respected for who they were, and in the end, they died. It's not like some story that would commonly be looked at as like some story of greatness, but I see it as a story of greatness because they persevered, they persisted, and I exist because they did that, right? I see it as greatness. I see it differently. And, I was the kid that sat in, history class, and they would get to that couple pages of slavery, and everybody in the class would turn and look at me like I was the representation of slavery, right? Like, and I can't be the only African-American kid that's been in that experience in this country without knowing a lot about their background and not having a position on why that's a prideful thing. And I had now developed a prideful thing in that, right? And so that's my work. My work is trying to give that it's very individually focused. It's not about like some broad political thing. It's not about some statement for society. It's literally me and you. My work is about me and a person, right?
And I feel that because it sounds like what your dad always wanted you to think about and sort of appreciate is what started to come out in your work. So, which involves tracking down the descendants of people you've researched and telling them their family stories. Wow, I can't imagine what that's like. I wonder if that is an emotional experience for people or like the range of things that you've heard. Can you help us just understand how people react?
I have a movie that's currently on the film festival circuit, and so I can't show it. But I talk to people about that every once in a while, and I get this question about, in your movie, do you show these experiences when you find these people? I don't. They're so personal, and they're so telling. It feels like something that I shouldn't even ask to share from a visual perspective with the world. But I can tell you from a context perspective, it takes commonly people a long while before they respond. Because ultimately, when I find these people, I'm no longer using the common tools of genealogy, because now I'm looking at private information, right? I'm using social media. These are people that are alive. So I'm using social media and newspaper articles to try to find the relationship to people that was where I stop in history, where that information is publicly available. Now it's private because there are people that are alive. And so trying to find them, I tend to have street addresses. So I'm sending them letters with genealogical trees that list them all the way up to this person.
It's the reverse of what like Henry Louis Gates did in Find Your Roots, because you think about this from a journalist perspective. You're talking to these people before they even know what's going on. So if you featured their reaction, it's kind of like you'd be making the decision for them to make this stuff public. So I appreciate that.
And that's the perspective. And so I'm also trying, I don't know how they're going to react. I get some people that respond. It tends to take months, sometimes years, before they realize this might be real. And then I tend to just all of a sudden get a phone call.
So can you then share like maybe the most profound or something that was profound or something that was maybe telling of the experience that you try to do?
Often it'll be this American that was enslaved. And in the end, I wind up with a person that doesn't know they have African descent. They tend to be a person of European descent, a white individual. And so that happens a lot. And so once they contact me, they sometimes are in a challenge mode of, I don't have Black lineage, you're not right. And so we have to go back and forth so that with information and primary sources before they get to a point where, oh, this might be true. I had an incident of that 2 years ago. The person I was researching, I was asked to research because they were a Civil War hero, and there was an exhibit at the New England Civil War Museum on this person. They were going to be recognized on the floor of the state capitol. This exhibit was being celebrated. It was going to be represented on the floor of the state capitol, and they wanted me to go find the current day descendants. I find them. They live in Wisconsin. They're white individuals. They're challenging it. Well, actually, they didn't even respond. So I ended up having to tell New England Civil War Museum, I found them, but they're not responding. Yeah. They eventually respond a year and a half later, but with a challenging perspective. So we went back and forth. I showed them the primary sources, and they said, well, I need DNA to believe this. So I sent them a DNA test. And when it came back, they were a little over 20% of African lineage. And that began their journey. I'm still talking to them daily. They now accept it. Now they want to know more.
That is a profound experience, and I appreciate you telling that. And that is kind of what we're here today to talk about, the work that people like John Mills do to understand our history and racism and some of the events that happen. And I appreciate that because many of us are looking back at the Revolutionary War. Spent years researching Black soldiers who fought in this war, but for many, freedom meant more than just independence from the British, right?
Absolutely. I mean, from the perspective, well, if you understand the story that's not told, right? Early 1775, George Washington is put in charge of this new fighting force in our country that's made up of these men from the various colonies, and he has to figure out who he wants to be and how he wants in this force and what he wants it to look like. And he's having these discussions. By the end of 1775, he decides, well, I don't want Black Americans in my fighting force. Well, they were already in his fighting force. They had already enlisted. They were fighting with the various colonies. They were in the revolution. They were fighting, right? But so he has to put out a general order to say, get all those Black Americans out of my fighting force. So George Washington does that. Lord Dunmore, who was the governor of Virginia at the time, who was loyal to the British, he anticipated that, so he puts out a statement, yeah, these people don't want you. So if you come fight with us, we'll give you your freedom. So of course, many African Americans who had been fighting under George Washington's army, now they ran towards the British. George Washington sees that happening, so then in December, a month after Lord Dunmore's statement, he puts out another statement that basically says, oh, my mistake, no. We don't want that. You can fight in our fighting force. That context is commonly missing from history. It's commonly not shared. But that perspective details the future. And it details who these men were. These were African Americans, not only, I don't tend to call them patriots because I think that belittles them. Like I see a patriot as a person who's loyal to the country and will die for it and is trying.
It's more of a nationalistic tenet,
right?
Sort of.
These men were that, but you have to add many more bullets below that.
Yes,
they were that, but also they were fighting against another system of oppression, which was a people they were fighting with. They were trying to prove their worth. They were trying to give freedoms to their families. There were just a lot more. Often they were fighting for their enslavers to allow them to be free, specifically for that, contractually for that. So it's just much greater than just patriot. I tend to call them revolutionaries.
The Alex Brienne Corporation does more than research. It also pushes for communities to honor these individuals through murals, street names, things like that. Can you talk about your vision there? Why it would be significant to have these names bestowed upon in this way?
Well, because many of the stories, as we've been talking about, have that context. Often the people that I'm researching are Revolutionary War soldiers or Civil War soldiers. almost always, if I find an African American Civil War soldier, he has an ancestor who was an African American Revolutionary War soldier. Almost always. It's almost always lineages of service. We're told the story from a perspective of it's like this individual, like one solid, singular individual. But it never is that. There are lineages. So that's the reasoning behind why I do this work. I'm trying to build that context into social consciousness, that it's more people than you think that were black and fighting in all of these major wars. It was families of people. It's not these isolated individuals. And when we tell the story of in celebrating the 250th, those people, because they've never been truly researched to understand those two pieces, that it's more people and it's lineages, then they tend to get left out. And when you get left out, you end up being a person like me as a child in school, and you're only brought up when we start talking about slavery. Right, and so it just doesn't I don't think it gives the African American community enough of an understanding of their stake in the creation of this nation and how they're directly aligned to it from a lineage perspective.
And then maybe by America 500, when somebody else is doing this work, if you're not still with us, I don't know what you look in great condition and shape, so maybe you'll be here at America 500, I don't know, but maybe white people finding out that they have black lineage or that they could be traced to African descent won't think of it as that big of a deal by then.
Well, yeah, maybe they won't, but I was here for America 200, that was in 1976, and yes. I was here for that, and I had, the only thing that I can say that was really exciting to me about that is that quarter with the drummer on the back, right? I remember that. That was really exciting to get that quarter. But other than that, I felt no alignment to it. Like, I don't say that from a perspective of critique. I'm just saying it is what it was. I didn't feel any alignment to the celebration of the nation. And that wasn't just me, that was my entire family. None of us were running around celebrating that this was the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration in 1976. But now in the 250th, recognizing my deep genealogical relationship to it, it means something different to me, right? And I want African Americans to see it in the way I see it now, have some deeper tie to it.
And I said America 500 because I want to kind of look to the future, because I'm talking to somebody who always looks backwards. So what do you hope? Is it that more black people, more African Americans understand from these stories that are in the spotlight? What can you help us understand here is that you hope that your work will do for the future?
Yeah, well, my work spans, creating, we find these people, these current day descendants, we give this information to them, and then our work is to inject these people into their communities so more people, specifically the African American community and these people that are related to them, understand who they were. So, like you said, it's street signs, it's murals, it's monuments, but it's also portraits. I tend to take the features of the current day descendants that I find. I commission an artist, and we recreate in a portrait what that ancestor looked like. So we've done 6 of those. Most of them are at museums around the state of Connecticut now. One is at the Museum of Connecticut History. The woman named Esther Jackson, she had 3 brothers who fought in the Revolution. Her father fought in the French and Indian. She had 7 grandsons who fought in the Civil War. 6 of them died while at war. I found their current day descendants. We created what she would have looked like from their features. That's at the Museum of Connecticut History today. I think it's the first portrait of an African American to have ever hung in that museum. So now when young school kids go through that museum, they're seeing this portrait of a black woman and this story of how deep her family is injected and were a part of the creation of the nation, going back before the Revolution, all the way through. Right, and so that's the kind of stuff we do. The intent is to get African Americans to understand their stake in it. Honestly, it's ancillary that everyone else benefits from it. From me, mine is very personal. Right? Does that make sense?
It's just beautiful to see the look in your eyes as you're talking about this. So when you talk about your passion and bringing this to life and doing this outside of what you do in your day job, I can really see it when you talk about it. So thank you for talking to us about it. I've been talking with John Mills, Connecticut resident and founder and president of the Alex Brienne Corporation. John's also the author of a new book, The Narrative of Primus, A Lineage Woven into American History. John, thank you so much. Great to have you on the show. Can't wait to talk with you more in the future.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thank you.
After the break, we're going to zoom out. How should America commemorate its 250th anniversary? And what responsibility do museums, educators, and historians have to tell a fuller story of our past? Stay with us. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Who decides which parts of America's past become part of the story we tell today and in the future? We're continuing our conversation about history, memory, and America's 250th anniversary. Joining me now is Alan Spears. He's Senior Director of Cultural Resources at the National Parks Conservation Association. Alan, so good to have you on the show, back on The Wheelhouse.
Yeah, good to be back. Thank you.
Also with us, Bilal Sekou, who is the professor of politics and government at the University of Hartford. Bilal, great to have you on the show.
Good morning and go Hawks.
And Erica Slocum, the director of interpretation and visitors experience at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism in Hartford.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on the program. We should note that Stowe Center for Literary Activism is actually a funder of Connecticut Public and supports the work that we do, so we appreciate that. Bilal, we just heard from John Mills, who's devoted his time to recovering stories that nearly disappeared. Mm-hmm. That raises a bigger question in our minds here. What happens when these recovered stories become part of our public history? I guess whether people want to be a part of it or not.
I mean, that's a good question, because I mean we're sort of in this moment, and I think we're going to talk about it later, which these stories people are trying to erase these stories. I think they're really important. I mean, what resonated with me in particular about that sort of interview you just had was that I thought also about my, growing up in Detroit and what history was like, what was taught to me in the schools, and, sort of going through a history book and you hear about Harriet Tubman, you hear about Booker T. Washington, you hear about Martin Luther King, you hear about a couple of other people, but for the most part, that sort of captured most of what Black history was thought about in America at the time. And so, like him growing up in America, and trying to figure out who I am, to trying to figure out, not only about my past, but also about my future. Because when I sort of deepen my understanding of Black history and learning about, those stories of progress and just a wide range of different fields and areas of American society. I remember in 1984 watching Jesse Jackson give his speech, at the Democratic National Convention, and the sense of pride that I felt and my understanding of his role in the civil rights movement, but also the role of countless people we don't talk about that often because we focus so much on certain personalities or certain individuals, mostly men, in the telling of those histories. But for me, that deeper understanding really helped me to understand a lot about myself, and also to help me think about how I move forward in life and what potential I actually have and what opportunities I could pursue if I put my mind to it, because I stood on the shoulders of people who had done a lot more than what the history books were teaching me.
And when you bring that up, you're talking about John Mills being in history class as a child, the 2 pages of African-American history that he's talking about, and some of his classmates looking at him like he's the representative of history. He sees Medgar Evers, people like that in a textbook, Martin Luther King. And more modernly, people, and you talk about future, more modernly, people think about Ryan Coogler and directing Black Panther and bringing Afrofuturism to the forefront. You spent, Alan, your career helping preserve historic places. Why do places matter? Why not just preserve books and documents?
Oh, well, we should preserve them all. I'm greedy. I want it all. I think because the way that our preservation ethic or ethos has evolved in this country is that we assign importance to various places. One of my favorite national parks is Gettysburg National Military Park in Pennsylvania. 3 days that really helped to define the Civil War and the future of the nation. And we refer to Civil War sites, especially the ones managed by the National Park Service, as being hallowed ground. And I think what I've tried to do, with a lot of help from my colleagues at the National Parks Conservation Association and in communities all across the country, is to expand that notion of hallowed ground to include places like the Tallahatchie County Courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, which is the place where that egregious miscarriage of justice took place in September of 1955, when the two men who murdered Emmett Till, who lynched Emmett Till, were found not guilty after a 75-minute deliberation by an all-white, all-male jury. That's hallowed ground, too. So places matter. And I just quickly add, I'm not looking to start a fight with Lonnie Bunch or Althea Hartig from the Smithsonian. It's really important that we take some of this history and put it on the road, put it in places like the Smithsonian. It's likely more people will come to Washington, D.C. or to New York or to big museum spaces. But we also want to make sure that we've got an organization like the National Park Service that can protect these places where they happen, because place is important, place matters. And that helps to instill a sense of pride in the community. And I don't want to speak for my colleagues and community partners in Mississippi, but there is something inherently righteous about taking this courthouse that was the scene of such a miscarriage of justice and turning it into a National Park Service site, thanks to President Biden in July of 2023, that now encourages people to understand the civil rights movement and the legacy of Emmett Till and his mother, the real hero in the story, Mamie Till Mobley.
And I just have to say this because there is a Mamie Till Mobley, because we talked about this before, Dr. Spears. At one point, I think you guys put some kind of statue or something on, or you were trying to, or a plaque to honor Mamie Till Mobley there.
Well, there might be a number of plaques, but what we did was the people in the Mississippi Delta, my colleagues down there, have been working on a way to formalize interpretive representation and commemoration, not celebration, but commemoration of this tragic event from August, September 1955. They've been working on that since the 1990s. And I sort of swing in as the blow-in in 2018 and help to push forward a campaign to establish a national monument. And a national monument is not the kind of obelisk that you see on the mall in Washington, D.C., but a national monument is a different kind of National Park Service site. Instead of being congressionally designated, it's established by the President of the United States, which is how we worked with President Biden to get this done. And so now in Sumner, Mississippi, and near Glendora, Mississippi, and then also on Chicago's south side at Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ. Those are the three contributing resource areas to the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument. So it's not just a plaque, not a statue, but an actual unit of the national park system. And it's in the same system as the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, the Frederick Douglass Home, and Gettysburg National Military Park. And I think there's something very righteous about that.
And I appreciate that. We're talking about places. We earlier talked about a history book. I brought up Black Panther as another way to talk about these things. And we're sort of just getting an understanding of different ways that people interpret history. Erica, let's talk about museums and having to make choices about what stories to include and I guess what stories can't fit or whatever. How did these decisions get made?
So I think for us, a lot of the decisions are made by doing deeper research, right? And having a deeper understanding of what stories are missing, right? So I think that oftentimes we see spaces and places being preserved that are designated for those names that are commonly known in the history books, right? Commonly written into the history, intentionally written into the history, and not those folks whose stories have been intentionally written out of the history, right? And so like one of the things that we've been doing at the Stowe Center is thinking about who are the people that she said influenced her? What are their stories, right? And being intentional about when Bilal was talking about it being the men, right? It being the white men, it being the black men, it being white women, right? Who have often been the ones that have been seen as the saviors of history, right? And so I think for us looking and saying, who are the specific names, right? Again, at the Stowe Center, Harriet made a list. So, we don't have to go far in saying who are the people who influenced her, because she wrote The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? So we're able to look at those stories and say, who are the people that we want to talk about? And again, being very intentional about the stories that we tell.
Curious to look at the last decade or so, or as much as you could tell us about visitor experience while you've been there. How's it changing? Are visitors asking different questions than they once did? What can you tell us about how people are kind of vibing while they're there?
Yeah, so I got to the Stowe Center in 2023. And I will say, I come from a Black Studies background, right? My PhD is in Black Studies. I'm in a space of, public history, right? And museums. And so when I came to the Stowe Center, I think that one of the things that that interpretation was telling was really looking at asking folks to think about history from a particular kind of lens, right? And so it's like the focus is on, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that's the way that they're bringing, Black history into the conversation. The focus was on connecting the past to the present. And so, asking folks in Harriet's house to think about, the Civil War and, the fugitive slave law, and then connecting that to things that are happening today, right? But it wasn't really directed by, I think, a wider history or a knowledge about how these things happen, right? Like there was this quote on the wall that we had in the museum. So she's the little lady who started this great war, right? Which I can say that Abraham Lincoln in our research never said that about Harriet Beecher Stowe. And so I think, again, being really intentional about how are we humanizing Harriet, right? Without, doing hero worship, seeing her journey and her path to writing Uncle Tom's Cabin in a real way, right? She grows up in an anti-slavery family. Her father is a colonizationalist, so he believes that this should remain a white Christian nation. And so he's like, yes, enslaved people should be free, and also send them to Africa, let them be missionaries, right? And so I think the way that we've looked at, Harriet's story, again, the Black folks who influenced her and inspired her, those literary activists who are doing that work, Josiah Henson, Harriet Jacobs, Sojourner Truth, and the list goes on, right? So looking at them and saying, here are all the Black people throughout her life, from the time she's born, right, in Litchfield, Connecticut, until the time that she writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, who are influencing her. Here are the white abolitionists who are influencing her, including but not limited to her brother and her sister, right? And so I think what's happening now, especially in the context of this current moment that we're living in, is that I think when visitors are coming to our space, they're coming to our space with the hope that they can have a deeper conversation, right? Because our tours are conversation based, but also that they're being asked to think about these historical figures as human, right? Black or white. If we're talking about Harriet, or if we're talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe, or if we're talking about Harriet Jacobs, or Josiah Henson, is to see the fullness of that. And I think often what's happening most recently that I've seen on our tours is that not only is the humanization of historical figures happening, but I also think that folks are able to see, and I mean folks of all ages, right? From the elementary school kids that we have coming into our space throughout the academic year to, adults that are coming into the space now, that they're seeing themselves reflected in the stories that we're telling.
Bilal, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and in particularly George Floyd as well, just to name a few, sparked a national conversation about America's history, Black history, the importance of education. We saw schools incorporate their lesson plans, more Black history and more books by Black authors. When you look outside of the window in the green room that you always come in to sit here, you see that mural that is right next to us on Asylum Avenue. That happened during this period. So from your experience, how do we see the ripple effects of this reckoning enter the classroom?
Yeah. Well, obviously we're in a very difficult place now with these conversations about race and this sort of assault at the national level by the current administration on things like DEI and the rewriting of history. But for that brief moment, and I say brief moment because it literally was a brief moment, what you described was just an amazing moment, right? Where people felt that there was a reckoning around race, issues of race. The thing that struck me about that moment was that, especially the George Floyd moment, was that this was caught on video. It was one of those moments where you could not deny the reality of the horror that we all had an opportunity to see. I'll admit, even up to this day, I was unable to watch the entire video because it's just that difficult to actually watch. For me, though, as an educator, I do want to say this, is that I have always treated issues of race and class and gender and sexual orientation as something that is really central and not peripheral to what I teach about American politics, right? I'm a trained political scientist, not a historian. But one of the things I clearly recognize is that when we talk about history, one of the things we should be very careful about is talking about history as something that just simply occurred in the past and has no sort of resonance or no effect on the present. And so for me, when I talk about, this history, whether I'm talking about enslavement and the impact enslavement had on the decisions that were made with regard to the institutions and the processes of the American political system and how we still live with the consequences of them. This is why it's so important, as Erica has talked about, for people who experienced the Stowe, Center. And I was one of those folks who got it wrong about that quote from Lincoln, and I was corrected on the spot about that. I just think it's so important that people sort of recognize that, but I think it's also important that we understand that visiting these sites, uplifting this history is not simply about a walk in the past, but it's about an understanding of who we are as a country today. And the challenge that I like to, talk about, because I was involved with the Connecticut 250 project. I was the co-chair of the educational subcommittee with Steve Armstrong. And we did a lot of work to try to help the schools, in particular K through 12, with curriculum and other ideas in terms of how to talk about 250. But I've just felt it's just critically important that we understand that this history is living, that we live with it today. And it's critical for all Americans to understand, certainly to talk about, and we talk about Black history, and I grew up with celebrating Black History Month, but this is American history. This still shapes and it's still unfolding today. It's not something in the past, but it's something that affects the present and is present, and it's also continuing to be shaped and transformed. So again, that reckoning on race was very brief. We're seeing a backlash to that reckoning right now. And I think it's very important for people like your guests who are doing the work that they're doing out there in the community to continue to do that work and to continue to push back against those efforts to try to suppress this history and this understanding of America.
Alan, addressing that backlash in this way, the Trump administration has argued that some historic sites have adopted what it calls a revisionist history interpretation of American history. Has the stance changed the work that you're doing, or at least the way you approach it? That federal stance?
Let's start with a dismissal of that accusation. It's absolute rubbish that's coming from the Trump administration. We know that. We're pushing back hard against that. And I think, I want to add, if I might, to what our guests have been talking about, and the fact that history is living. Because I think the Trump administration would tell you that Black people especially are just overly focused, hyper-focused on history. and hyper-focused on the negative aspects of that history. Well, there's a reason why. And if we go back to the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in this country or in world history, none of the European powers that were engaged in the African slave trade could square the abomination that was slavery with their religious beliefs and practices. But they couldn't let go of the profits. So how do you square that circle? You do that by creating a system of white supremacy and Black or African subordination that says a couple of things. One, that Black people are not fully human, that we have no science, no art, no poetry, nothing in the way of lasting, meaningful contributions to the planet or even to our own societies and cultures, that you can whip us and beat us and rape us, and that it's better if you do that in a Christian country, in Georgia or in New York, as opposed to leaving us in the jungles, quote unquote, of Africa. And when you roll out a philosophy like that, for 5 years, 10 years, 250 years, you get to the point where a young man like Emmett Till, 14-year-old boy from Chicago, can be lynched because he whistled at a white woman. You get to a point where you can have George Floyd, a police officer, put his knee on the man's neck for 8 minutes while he chokes out the life of him. Because what we have in the past, those systems that were created, that we don't matter, that our history is non-existent, that we've never made any positive lasting contributions to the planet or to this country, that's the way people can easily begin to disappear or erase us. We're not important. Frederick Douglass, I think it was 1878, talked about the composite nation. And it was one of the last speeches that Douglass made where he kind of evinced any sort of optimism about the country. And he talked about the fact that way back in 1878, the diversity in this nation was its strength. And what we're beginning to see right now coming from the Trump administration is actually the opposite of that, the view that we are not members of a composite nation, but that we're guests here, and some of us have overstayed our welcome. And that's where the push to soften, sanitize, or erase history is coming from. And that's why all of us, everyone in this country who cares about this country, who cares about humanity, cares about our future, wants an opportunity for us to come together and heal, has to push back and fight back against this effort just as forcefully as we can.
Glad you invoked the name of Frederick Douglass there, the North Star, a big inspiration to the Wheelhouse and what we try to do with our program. So thank you for bringing that up here. This hour, we're looking back at the people whose stories were overlooked and at the institutions trying to preserve a more complete picture of America's past. Coming up after the break, we set our sights on the future. What can happen when more voices become part of the story? And what does the next 250 years of America look like if we carry those lessons with us? Stick with us. You're listening to Connecticut Public. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We've been asking how America remembers its past and what happens when stories that were overlooked are brought into the conversation. But history isn't only about looking backward. The stories we choose to preserve today will shape how future generations understand this moment. So as America marks its 250th anniversary, we're entering today's show with a forward-looking question. What do we want the next chapter of American history to include? We have Erica Slocum, the Director of Interpretation and Visitors Experience with the Stowe Center for Literary Activism, Bilal Sekou, the Professor of Politics and Government at the University of Hartford, and Senior Director of Cultural Resources at the National Parks Conservation Association, Alan Spears. Bilal, some people hear the phrase telling a more complete history and worry it means erasing another version of history. How do you respond to that concern?
I mean, that it's nonsense, of course. And, you know, it's really important not only to tell this history because it's really about the future and shaping the future of America. I know in the work that I've done in the democracy space, you know, the language I use is about creating a pluralistic democracy. And I'll really quickly say that in the work that I've done and reflecting on this 250th anniversary, I have really drawn inspiration from the words of the Declaration, even if the intent of the writers of the Declaration did not have a vision of me being able to sit on air with you and do a show like this or be able to teach at a university. But I take real those words that all men are created equal, and I use that in the sense of not just men, but all people are created equal. And to me, that's the North Star that should guide our thinking about America and about its future.
Intentionality is something I want to focus on with Erica. A July 15th special report from the Heritage Foundation titled The Heritage Guide to Historic Sites, Rediscovering America's Heritage, was critical of the Stowe Center of Literary Activism, saying it's focused too much on, quote, provoking visitors into having modern political conversations instead of focus on history. The phrasing there, provoke, in your experience, is that an accurate depiction of what the museum offers? How do you encourage visitors to engage with difficult history without telling them to think? And I guess tell us what the Heritage Foundation is too. Sorry. A lot. Go ahead.
So I think that we don't provoke, we invite. So I'll say that first and foremost. And I will also say that to the point about being intentional, like the intentionality is in, how are we getting people to think about, like I said before, getting them to think about history in full ways and their humanity in full ways, right? And I think that people who have a certain kind of perspective on history and want to preserve a particular narrative about history, what they're missing is perspective, right? And I think that what we offer at the Stowe Center is a wider perspective, right? On how do you go from one way of thinking and move into another way of thinking, and doing that again together with folks, whether that's on a tour, whether that's at a salon, or at a Stowe on the Go workshop or experience, is that we're thinking about these things together and we're doing the work together with not one way of thinking, with not one perspective. And so even when we're bringing in those histories into the space in the Stowe Center or whatever experience we have, that we're consistently thinking about Stowe, the people who influenced her, and the people who influenced them.
The Heritage Foundation that authored that quote can be accused of having a very narrow focus. They had Project 2025 under them as well, we'll note. Imagine someone sitting down to celebrate America's 500th anniversary, Alan. We looked to this earlier when I talked to John Mills, and I only want to do this in about 90 seconds or less. What do you hope they'll say about the way we chose to tell our history in 2026?
I hope we move through this national fever that we've got right now to a place where we understand that history is important, that we need to make our history accurate, inclusive, just, and equitable. We've been working for the last 30 years with the National Park Service. They've been a great federal partner with communities all across this country to do that. And that's why the current assault that we're seeing on history is such an abomination.
You've been listening to Alan Spears. He's Senior Director of Cultural Resources at the National Parks Conservation Association. Alan, thank you for coming back on the Wheelhouse. Thank you for giving us your time.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Great to be with you all.
Bilal Sekou, who is the Professor of Politics and Government at the University of Hartford. Bilal, always great to have you on the show.
Go Hawks.
Erica Slocum is the Director of Interpretation and Visitor Experience at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism. Very close to us, Farmington Avenue. And what's the actual address?
We're at 77 4th Street.
4th Street, Farmington Avenue and 4th Street. Stowe Center for Literary Activism. And we should note that the Stowe Center for Literary Activism is a funder of Connecticut Public. Erica, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
What a show, produced by Chloe Wynn. As Dr. Spears would say, we didn't really focus on bayonets and bullets in this show. So thank you so much, Alan Spears. It was edited by Eric Ossen. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Special thanks to our talk show visuals and operations teams here at Connecticut Public. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.